Hey, what's going on? Tim Werner here, welcoming you to a brief lesson called Display ARM Data on your Azure Portal Dashboard. In Azure Resource Manager, that's what ARM stands for, we have a fabric of REST, Representational State Transfer Application Programming Interfaces, or APIs. That fabric really is exposed as a single namespace that starts with Microsoft, and then we have a dot, and then we have a resource provider, compute, storage, Azure SQL, as the case may be, and this flows down to describe individual resources and ultimately operations on those resources. You might already know that REST is a programming model, a state of mind, let's say, that uses HTTP endpoints to do various operations: create, read, update, delete, also called CRUD. Now, the ARM API has as its public endpoint management.azure.com. Okay, Tim, cool. I'm not a programmer. Why do I care? Well, let's go into the demo and I'll explain why you should care. One thing we can do is tap directly into that ARM REST API and display resource details directly on the dashboard, as you see here. On my dashboard, I'm showing properties of a particular VM. I've got the wrong title here, so let me select Edit to edit this tile, and I'm going to change this to Ubuntu One details. And as you can see, we can drill into these properties. For instance, if I come down to the Properties row and click, we can come in and look at, for instance, the OS profile property and get metadata about who the administrator ID is, extensions, computer name. It's pretty useful from an inventory management standpoint. Networking details, we can drill into network interfaces. This is one thing we'll look at. Also, you see on the right, we've got a tile that just shows the runtime state of the VM. You can see that my Ubuntu One VM is stopped and deallocated. And if we click the tile, we can go directly to the Ubuntu virtual machine blade, as we see here. Now let's come back to the dashboard. And then finally, you see I have two action buttons that'll either start or stop and deallocate that virtual machine. Let me click Start. And if we come up into the notification area, we can see that that command succeeded. What is this? What are we talking about here? Well, what we're talking about is a couple built-in dashboard tiles. One is called ARM Data. That's what I have here on the left. And the other is called ARM Actions, which is what you see over on the right. And it's a clever way to call the ARM REST API and perform that action directly in the context of a dashboard. Let me show you how it works from front to back. I'm going to click plus here to create a new dashboard, and I'll call this ARM API. I'm going to click Done Customizing just to show you the full workflow if you're not familiar. You can right-click to edit the new dashboard, and we have a tile gallery. I'm going to look for ARM, and we can see ARM Data and ARM Actions. I'm going to click Add to bring ARM Data out, and I'm also going to bring ARM Actions out twice. Let me go to Done Customizing, because there's one more tile I want to add, and we don't actually need to do that from the tile gallery. To bring back, let me open my dashboards list and come back to where we just were. To bring this guy out, we can do that within the context of the virtual machine itself. Again, let's switch back to our new dashboard. In case you haven't put it together yet, I'm trying to give you a quick start education on using these Azure dashboards, and I hope that you're finding it helpful. Actually, let me go to the search bar and go to virtual machines. And if I right-click my Ubuntu One row, I can pin this to the dashboard, like so. So that means now we've got that, and it's now running fine. How do we configure these? Well, to configure the ARM Data tile, let's click Configure Tile. We can give it a name. I'm going to call this Ubuntu Properties. The URI is the main thing. What we're doing here, actually, let me open up another browser tab and look for ARM REST API. This is a really great site you should have bookmarked, even if your job role isn't necessarily that of a developer. And what we've got here is a full description of the REST operation groups. They're grouped together by functionality. And what we're dealing with here is compute. So let me scroll down the resource provider list and click Compute, and we can look at the REST operation groups just for this resource provider. If we go into virtual machines, for instance, we can start to inspect properties there. And we've got the different REST methods, GET being a very common one. And for the ARM Data tile, all we're going to do is issue a GET request against our own subscriptions endpoint. Let's go to get. And the documentation gives you the code that you need right here. Get, and then we have the full URI. And we can add parameters there to pull additional data about the view and instance of the virtual machine. Let me open up Visual Studio Code and I'll show you what I have. What we've got in an ARM API call is the method that we're calling, get, in this first example. Then we have the endpoint with the protocol identifier. We're doing HTTPS, so this is an authenticated call as well. Because we're doing the call from within the portal, we don't have to worry about the authentication piece. Then we have our resource path. That's this piece here, subscriptions, and then I have my subscription ID, resource groups, and resource group name. Provider is Microsoft.compute, virtual machines, and then we have the virtual machine. I want not VM one, but Ubuntu one. And then we have our query. In this case, I'm going to do the expand operation to show instance details. And then we have appended on the very end an API version. So this is actually going to be what we're going to need. And in the tile, we don't need the endpoint or the verb. The verb and the endpoint are baked into the tile. So I'm just going to grab from /subscriptions on. And if we come back to the portal now, I'm going to paste that URI in. You can change the refresh interval. It's going to enable auto-refresh by default. 30 is the minimum refresh interval. And let's click done. And then if we refresh, the get is a little bit slow to do, unfortunately. Once the call finishes, it'll either work and display data, or it'll give an error message. You also, at this time, have the ability to resize the tile, which I will take advantage of, and I'll also adjust my other tiles here. Let's go to Done Customizing, and let's reconfigure that tile. Most of the time, these mistakes turn into simple matters. It's not a question of getting lost in the deep technical weeds. It turns out my problem is that I have the wrong resource group in there. The resource group is Ubuntu 1. Actually, I think it's just Ubuntu. And then let's move down and verify that my virtual machine is Ubuntu 1. Yes, it is. So we can click Done and refresh. And as expected, the metadata fills in. So that's the result of that get ARM API call. So far, so good. Let's come back to Visual Studio. Now for the ARM action, that instead of just a data retrieval, we're going to perform a post. And so here we're performing some kind of read-write action on the resource. And so we're going to, again, use the same basic structure to compose our URI. Again, verify the resource group. It looks like it's correct in my second example. I also have the virtual machine name correct. You're going to either do a deallocate here or a start. How do I know that? Again, if we come back to the API reference, and if I back up to look at the virtual machine operations groups, we can come down to the method that we want to undertake. There's start. Or if we come up to the top, deallocate is to stop and deallocate the virtual machine. And you get the syntax for the URI as well as the appropriate API version directly from the documentation as usual. So let me come back and select this. Again, I'm just going to come up to the subscriptions node. We don't need the endpoint in this case. And we'll come back to the portal. And for our first ARM action, we'll configure the tile, and I'll call this Start Ubuntu 1. I'll paste in the URI. And action is going to be the label on the button. I'll call it Start. Let me scroll out to get to my Done button here. And now we'll do the same thing for this second ARM action. We'll configure the tile. I'll call this Stop Ubuntu 1. Paste in the URI. And again, I'll want to fix the URI for my start because as it occurred to me, it's still calling deallocate. And I'll label the button Stop. You see? Click Done. Let me come back to the first button, scroll back in, find the appropriate spot in the URI, and I'm going to substitute Start for deallocate. All right, neat. Sweeping up the shavings here, looks like I've mislabeled my ARM data viewer, so let me edit this one more time and change this to Ubuntu 1. Fix the casing there. Click Done. Now, we have this get configured to auto refresh, but you can also configure auto refresh for the entire dashboard, which I'll do just to be safe. Let's test our ARM action button to see if it works. Our virtual machine is currently running. Let's click Stop. We come up to the notification bell. That was a success, so we should find if we refresh the dashboard that Ubuntu 1 is now deallocating. All systems are go. Lastly, from the Sharing is Caring files, I want to briefly show you how you can share dashboards with your colleagues. You might spend time using the ARM data and ARM action tiles here to create some really informative dashboards that you want to share with your colleagues. After all, these dashboards are just going to be associated with your Azure Active Directory user account. Now, you can download your dashboard definitions directly in JSON format, and by contrast, you can upload. So one thing is just to share the file directly with your colleague. Another, though, perhaps more efficient way, is to use the Share button here and share the dashboard. You give it a name, and then associate it with a subscription, and by default, it'll be published to a resource group called Dashboards. Once you've published the dashboard, we can come back to the sharing control and either unpublish it or, under access control, go to Manage Users. This takes you to the familiar role-based access control list. This is going to allow you to share the dashboard, and as long as your colleague has at least read access to the dashboard, they'll be able to load it. That having been said, understand that just because a colleague can read the dashboard does not necessarily mean that the ARM data and ARM action controls will work. They'll have to have additional privilege level to those resources in order for that to work. I hope that makes sense. As usual, I like to end my lessons with some learning resources. First, a shortcut URL to the ARM REST API reference, timw.info/AR1. There is a worthwhile tool to get familiar with the structure of the ARM REST API namespace, the resource provider namespace. That's at timw.info/AR2. And then for some additional details on customizing the Azure dashboard, we have timw.info AR3. Thanks a lot for joining me in this lesson. You can find me on Twitter at TechTrainerTim. My Pluralsight courses are at timw.info/PS, and my website is techtrainertim.com. Take good care.